The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quiet streets of Millbrook, a small town tucked away in rural Georgia. Lieutenant General David Washington had just finished visiting his mother at her cozy house on Elm Street, where she'd lived for the past 30 years. At 78, she still insisted on making his favorite peach cobbler whenever he came to visit, even though his trips home had become less frequent due to his demanding military duties. David walked slowly to his car, savoring the peaceful moment. His mother had spent the afternoon telling him stories about the neighbors and asking when he planned to retire. "You've given enough to your country," she'd said, patting his hand with her weathered fingers. "It's time you thought about yourself." He'd simply smiled and promised to consider it, though they both knew he wasn't ready to hang up his uniform just yet. The drive back to the highway should have taken only 15 minutes through the town's main streets. David had made this same trip dozens of times over the years, and Millbrook had always felt like a place where time moved a little slower. Today was no different, or so he thought. He drove his modest sedan at a comfortable pace, listening to jazz music and thinking about his mother's words. Officer Blake Stevens had been patrolling the same streets for 8 years, and today had been particularly quiet. He'd written 2 parking tickets and responded to a noise complaint about teenagers playing music too loud at the park. Now, as his shift neared its end, he spotted a black sedan with out-of-state plates driving through downtown. Something about the car caught his attention, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Blake flipped on his lights and pulled behind the sedan. In his mind, he was just doing his job, making sure everything was in order. Out-of-state plates always warranted a second look in his book, especially when the driver looked like he might not belong in their quiet town. He radioed in the license plate number and waited for the car to pull over. David saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror and felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. Even after decades of military service, even with all his accomplishments and rank, moments like these still made him tense. He'd learned long ago that his uniform and medals meant nothing when he was just another black man driving through an unfamiliar town. He pulled over carefully, turned off the engine, and placed his hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. Blake approached the driver's side window with his hand resting on his belt. The driver appeared calm and had his hands visible, which was good. But something about the situation still felt off to Blake. Maybe it was the expensive watch on the man's wrist or the way he sat too straight and composed. Blake had developed what he called a sixth sense about these things over the years. "License and registration," Blake said, his voice already carrying an edge of suspicion. He peered through the window at David, taking in the crisp polo shirt and the confident way the man met his gaze. There was something about people who acted like they had nothing to hide that always made Blake more suspicious, not less. David reached slowly for his wallet, making sure to announce each movement. "I'm reaching for my wallet now," he said calmly. "My registration is in the glove compartment. May I get it?" "Yeah, but keep your hands where I can see them," Blake replied, stepping back slightly. He watched as David retrieved the documents with careful, deliberate movements. When David handed over his license, Blake noticed the address was from Virginia near Washington, D.C. His suspicion grew stronger. "What brings you to Millbrook?" Blake asked, examining the license more carefully than necessary. The photo matched, but something about the whole situation rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was the man's calm demeanor, or the fact that he didn't seem nervous enough for Blake's liking. "I was visiting my mother," David replied evenly. "She lives on Elm Street. I'm heading back home now." Blake studied the license again, then looked back at David. "David Washington, huh? You know how fast you were going?" David knew he hadn't been speeding, but he also knew that arguing would only make things worse. "I believe I was going the speed limit, officer. Is there a problem?" "I clocked you doing 40 in a 35 zone, Blake said, which wasn't true, but he'd learned that most people wouldn't argue with a confident statement. "Step out of the vehicle." David's heart rate increased, but his voice remained steady. "Officer, I don't believe I was speeding. Is it necessary for me to step out for a simple traffic violation?" Blake's expression hardened. In his experience, people who questioned his authority usually had something to hide. "Sir, I'm not going to ask again. Step out of the vehicle now." David unbuckled his seatbelt slowly and opened the door. As he stood, Blake noticed how tall he was, probably 6'2", with the bearing of someone used to command. This only made Blake more suspicious. He'd dealt with plenty of guys who thought they were tough, and he wasn't about to be intimidated. "Turn around and put your hands on the car," Blake instructed, his hand moving closer to his weapon. David complied without argument. Placing his palms flat against the roof of his sedan, Blake began patting him down, more roughly than necessary. "Officer, I'm a United States Army officer," David said quietly, hoping this information might diffuse the situation. "My military ID is in my wallet." Blake paused for a moment, then continued his search. "Sure you are," he said with a dismissive laugh. "And I'm the President of the United States. You got any weapons on you?" "No weapons," David replied, maintaining his composure despite the officer's sarcasm. "My identification will verify my military service. I'm a lieutenant general in the United States Army." Blake finished his pat-down and stepped back. "A general, huh? What's a general doing driving through Millbrook in a beat-up sedan?" He looked at David's car with obvious disdain. "Shouldn't you be in some fancy government car with a driver?" David turned around slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Officer, I'd appreciate it if you would look at my military identification. It's in my wallet with my driver's license." Blake pulled out the wallet and flipped through it carelessly. When he found the military ID card, he barely glanced at it before shoving it back at David. "This could be fake for all I know. Anyone can get these made online these days." The dismissal stung, but David had faced worse. He'd commanded thousands of soldiers, managed multi-million-dollar operations, and briefed presidents. Yet here he stood being treated like a common criminal by a small-town police officer who refused to even look at his credentials properly. "Officer Stevens," David said, reading the name tag. "I understand you're doing your job, but I haven't committed any violation that warrants this level of investigation. I'm simply trying to drive home after visiting my elderly mother." Blake's eyes narrowed at the use of his name. He didn't like being called out, especially not by someone he was investigating. "How do you know my name?" "It's on your name tag," David replied simply. "Don't get smart with me," Blake snapped. "I decide when this stop is over, not you. Now I'm going to search your vehicle. You got any drugs, weapons, or anything else illegal in there?" David knew his rights, but he also knew that refusing would only escalate the situation further. "Officer, I don't consent to a search, but I won't physically resist if you choose to proceed." Blake interpreted this as suspicious behavior. Why would an innocent person refuse a search unless they had something to hide? "Open the trunk," he ordered. As David reached for his keys, he caught sight of a woman across the street walking her dog. She had stopped and was watching the scene unfold with obvious concern. David wondered what she saw when she looked at them. A police officer doing his job, or something else entirely. The trunk contained nothing more suspicious than a bag of his mother's homemade cookies and a folder of military documents he'd been reviewing during his visit. Blake rifled through everything carelessly, scattering papers and disturbing the careful organization of David's belongings. "What are all these papers?" Blake demanded, holding up a classified briefing folder. "Those are official military documents," David replied. "Some of them contain sensitive information." Blake's suspicion reached new heights. Now the man was claiming to have government secrets in his car. This was getting more interesting by the minute. "Sensitive information, huh? Like what kind of sensitive information?" David realized he was in an impossible situation. He couldn't explain the contents of classified documents to a civilian, but his refusal to do so would only make him look more suspicious. "Officer, I'm not at liberty to discuss classified military matters with unauthorized personnel." "Unauthorized personnel?" Blake's voice rose. "I'm a sworn police officer. I have authority here." "I understand that, officer, but military classification levels operate under federal jurisdiction. I'd be happy to have my commanding officer speak with you to verify my identity and status." Blake slammed the trunk shut harder than necessary. The afternoon had taken a turn he hadn't expected, and now he felt like he was being played. Either this man was exactly who he claimed to be, which seemed impossible, or he was running some kind of elaborate con game. Either way, Blake wasn't about to let himself be fooled. Blake Stevens walked back to his patrol car with David's documents, his mind racing with possibilities. The whole situation felt wrong to him, though he couldn't put his finger. And exactly why. Maybe it was the way this David Washington carried himself, too confident for someone who'd just been pulled over. Maybe it was those papers in the trunk that looked official but could easily be fake. Or maybe it was just that feeling he got when something didn't add up. He slid into the driver's seat and called his dispatcher. "Unit 7 to base," he said into his radio, keeping his eyes on David, who stood patiently beside his sedan, with his hands clasped behind his back in a military posture. "Go ahead. Unit 7, came the crackling response. "I need you to run a full background check on a David Washington. Virginia license plate number." Blake read off the numbers while watching David's reflection in his side mirror. The man hadn't moved, hadn't tried to get back in his car, hadn't even pulled out a cell phone. This bothered Blake more than if he had been fidgeting or nervous. While waiting for the background check, Blake studied the military ID card more carefully. It looked real enough, with all the right holograms and official seals. But these days, anyone with a decent printer and some computer skills could fake government documents. He'd seen it before. People pretending to be veterans to get discounts or sympathy. This felt like something bigger, though. Unit 7. Background check shows clean record, no warrants, no priors. The dispatcher reported back. "Vehicle registration matches the license." Blake frowned. He'd expected something. Anything that would justify his growing suspicion. Clean record sometimes made him more suspicious, not less. In his experience, people who had never been caught were often the ones worth watching most closely. He got out of his car and walked back to David, who hadn't moved from his position. "Your story checks out so far," Blake said, handing back the license but keeping the military ID. "But I've got some questions about this military card." David remained calm, though inside he felt the familiar exhaustion that came with these encounters. "What questions do you have, officer? For one thing, how do I know this is real?" Blake held up the ID card, examining it in the afternoon sunlight. "Says here you're a lieutenant general. That's pretty high up, right?" "Yes, sir." "It's a 3-star rank." Blake laughed, a sound without humor. 3 stars, huh? And you just drive around by yourself in a regular car, visiting your mommy?" His tone had become openly mocking now. "Where's your security detail? Where's your government car?" David had heard variations of these questions before. "Officer, military personnel are allowed personal time and personal vehicles. We don't travel with security details for routine family visits." "Uh-huh." Blake pocketed the military ID instead of returning it. "And these papers in your trunk, all that classified stuff. What's that about?" "As I mentioned, I can't discuss classified materials with unauthorized personnel, but my commanding officer can verify my identity and clearance level if you'd like to contact the appropriate channels." Blake's suspicion hardened into certainty. The man was being too evasive, too careful with his words. "You know what I think?" he said, stepping closer to David. "I think you're running some kind of scam. I think you got yourself some fake military ID and you drive around pretending to be important." David kept his voice level. "Officer Stevens, I understand your caution, but I assure you my credentials are genuine. Would you like me to provide you with contact information to verify my identity?" "Oh, I bet you've got all kinds of fake phone numbers and contacts set up," Blake replied. "Probably got someone ready to answer and pretend to be your commanding officer, right?" The accusation was so far from reality that David almost smiled, but he caught himself. Smiling would only make things worse. "That's not the case, officer." Blake keyed his radio again. "Unit 7 requesting backup for suspicious activity investigation." David felt his heart sink. Calling for backup meant this situation was about to get much more complicated. "Officer, is backup really necessary for a traffic stop?" "It is when I've got someone with fake government credentials and classified documents," Blake replied. "You just stand right there and keep your hands where I can see them." Within 5 minutes, another patrol car arrived with Officer Tony Rodriguez behind the wheel. Tony had worked with Blake for 3 years and had learned to trust his partner's instincts about suspicious situations. As he approached, Blake filled him in on what he'd discovered. "Claims to be a general," Blake said, loud enough for David to hear. "Got fake military ID and a trunk full of papers he says are classified. Won't explain what they are." Tony looked David up and down, taking in his neat appearance and calm demeanor. "You military?" he asked. Yes, sir. Lieutenant General David Washington, United States Army. Tony had served 4 years in the Marines before becoming a police officer, and something about the way David stood and spoke seemed familiar. But Blake was his partner, and if Blake said something was off, Tony was inclined to believe him. General Washington, Blake said with exaggerated formality. Why don't you explain to Officer Rodriguez here what you were doing in Millbrook today? David repeated his story about visiting his mother, maintaining the same calm tone he'd used throughout the encounter. Tony listened carefully, noting the man's composure and the way he answered questions directly without elaborating unnecessarily. It reminded him of how officers were trained to respond during interrogations. Where did you serve? Tony asked, curiosity getting the better of him. I've served in multiple theaters over the past 25 years, David replied. Most recently, I was involved in operations planning at the Pentagon. Blake rolled his eyes. Pentagon, right, of course. Why not just say you work directly for the president while you're at it? I do brief senior leadership regularly, David said simply, which only made Blake more convinced he was dealing with a pathological liar. Tony studied David's face more carefully. There was something about his bearing that seemed genuine, but Tony had to admit the story sounded far-fetched. What were the odds of a real general getting pulled over in their small town? You got any proof besides this ID card? Tony asked. Maybe someone who can vouch for you? David nodded. I can provide contact information for my commanding officer or the Pentagon duty desk. They can verify my identity and current assignment. Blake stepped between them. Tony, don't fall for this. Guy probably has people ready to answer phones and pretend to be whoever he needs them to be. This whole thing is a setup. A setup for what? Tony asked. I don't know yet, but nobody just happens to be driving through Millbrook with a trunk full of classified documents, Blake replied. Maybe he's selling secrets, maybe he's planning something. All I know is his story doesn't add up. David realized the situation was spiraling beyond anything he could control with words alone. Blake had convinced himself of a narrative that cast David as some kind of criminal mastermind, and every piece of evidence that contradicted that narrative was being dismissed as part of an elaborate deception. Officers, David said carefully, I understand this situation may seem unusual to you, but I'd like to request that you contact my chain of command to verify my identity before this goes any further. Chain of command, Blake repeated mockingly. Listen to him, Tony, he's got all the lingo down perfect. Probably studied up on military terminology before running his scam. Tony was beginning to feel uncomfortable with his partner's increasingly aggressive tone, but he also knew that Blake had good instincts about people. Still, something about this situation felt different from their usual encounters with suspicious individuals. What's your mother's address? Tony asked suddenly. David provided the Elm Street address without hesitation. Tony knew the street. It was in an older part of town where many longtime residents lived. Mrs. Washington, David continued. She's lived there for 30 years. Retired schoolteacher. You can ask any of her neighbors about her son who visits from out of state. Blake wasn't interested in verifying the family story. In his mind, it was all part of the elaborate deception. Tony, we need to search him again and get these documents looked at by someone who knows what they're looking for. I've already been searched once, David pointed out. And as I've explained, I cannot allow unauthorized personnel to examine classified materials. Cannot allow? Blake's voice rose. You don't get to allow or not allow anything here, buddy. I'm the one with the badge. The woman with the dog had been joined by other onlookers. Word was spreading through the neighborhood that something unusual was happening. David could see faces in windows and people standing on porches, all watching the scene unfold. Blake noticed the growing audience and felt the pressure to assert his authority. He couldn't let this man make him look foolish in front of the whole neighborhood. You know what? I think we need to take you in for further questioning. On what charges? David asked. Suspicious activity, possible fraud, possession of potentially stolen government property, Blake rattled off. We'll figure out the rest down at the station. Tony shifted uncomfortably. Blake, maybe we should call this into the supervisor first. No need, Blake replied quickly. We've got probable cause. Guy's got fake military credentials and classified documents he can't explain. That's enough for me. David knew he was at a critical juncture. Once he was arrested, even if the charges were eventually dropped, the damage would be done. His career, his reputation, Everything he'd worked for could be compromised by a booking photo and an arrest record. Officer Stevens, Officer Rodriguez, he said, using their names deliberately to personalize the moment. I'm asking you one more time to please verify my identity through official channels before taking any irreversible actions. One phone call to the Pentagon can clear this up in 5 minutes. Blake pulled out his handcuffs. Save it for the judge, General Washington, he said with heavy sarcasm. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. David looked at Tony, hoping to see some sign of doubt or hesitation that he could appeal to. But Tony had made his choice to stand by his partner, right or wrong. As the handcuffs clicked into place, David felt the weight of the moment. In a few seconds, his entire life had been reduced to this: a black man in handcuffs standing beside his car while 2 white police officers treated him like a common criminal. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent his career defending the very system that now seemed determined to humiliate him. The handcuffs felt cold and tight around David's wrists as Officer Stevens guided him toward the patrol car. The small crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk watched in silence, some with phones raised, recording the scene. David kept his head up and his shoulders straight, drawing on decades of military training to maintain his composure even as humiliation burned in his chest. Watch your head, Blake said with mock courtesy as he helped David into the back seat of the patrol car. The gesture was routine, but his tone carried a satisfaction that made David's jaw tighten. Blake slammed the door and walked back to confer with Tony, their voices low but their gestures animated. David sat in the cramped back seat, his hands secured behind him, and tried to process what had just happened. In 30 minutes, he'd gone from a simple family visit to being arrested by officers who refused to believe his identity. The absurdity of it would have been laughable if the consequences weren't so serious. Through the patrol car's window, he could see Blake rifling through his vehicle again, pulling out the folder of documents and examining them with exaggerated interest. Tony stood nearby, occasionally glancing toward the patrol car where David sat. David caught his eye once and saw something that might have been uncertainty, but Tony quickly looked away. The radio in the patrol car crackled to life periodically with routine police chatter. David listened with growing frustration as the officers discussed what to do with him, treating him like a puzzle they needed to solve rather than a human being whose freedom they were violating. After 20 minutes, Blake approached the patrol car and opened the door. "All right, General Washington," he said, the title dripping with sarcasm. "We're taking you to the station for processing. You'll get your phone call there." "Officer Stevens," David said, looking directly at him, "I want to make that phone call now." Blake laughed. "That's not how this works. You get your call after we book you, not before." "Actually," Tony interjected, walking over to join them, "he's right. He's entitled to a phone call. We don't have to wait until we get to the station." Blake shot his partner an annoyed look. "Tony, we've got this under control. Let's just get him processed and let the detective sort it out." But Tony's Marine training had taught him about procedures and rights, and something about the whole situation was bothering him more by the minute. "Blake, what's it going to hurt to let him make one call? If he's running a scam like you think, we'll figure it out quick enough." David seized the opportunity. "I'd like to make that call now, please." Blake reluctantly agreed, more to avoid an argument with his partner than out of any sense of fairness. "Fine, but you're making it right here where we can hear every word. And if you try to warn any accomplices or destroy evidence, that's another charge." "I understand," David replied. Blake uncuffed one of David's hands and handed him his cell phone from the evidence bag. "You've got 5 minutes." David's fingers were stiff from the handcuffs, but he managed to navigate to his contacts and find the number he needed. It was a direct line he'd only used in genuine emergencies, but if this didn't qualify as an emergency, nothing did. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Joint Chiefs, Admiral Harrison speaking." "Admiral, this is Lieutenant General Washington," David said, his voice carrying across the quiet street. Blake and Tony exchanged glances, not expecting the call to be answered so professionally. "David?" Admiral Harrison's voice sharpened with concern. "What's wrong? You sound stressed." "Sir, I'm currently detained by local police in Millbrook, Georgia. They don't believe my identification is genuine and have arrested me on suspicion of fraud and possession of classified materials." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "They've arrested you? Are you injured?" "No, sir, I'm not injured. But I need verification of my identity and status. The officers seem to think I'm running some kind of impersonation scam. Blake leaned closer, trying to hear both sides of the conversation. The voice on the other end sounded official enough, but he still wasn't convinced this wasn't an elaborate setup. "Put one of the officers on the phone," Admiral Harrison said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. David held out the phone toward Blake. "The Admiral would like to speak with you." Blake hesitated, then took the phone. "This is Officer Stevens, Millbrook Police Department." "Officer Stevens, this is Admiral Patricia Harrison, Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff," came the crisp reply. "You have detained one of my officers based on what I understand to be a question about his credentials. Is that correct?" Blake felt a chill run down his spine at the woman's tone, but he pressed forward. "Ma'am, we've got someone here claiming to be a general, but his story doesn't add up. He could have anyone answer a phone and pretend to be whoever he wants." "Officer Stevens, I want you to listen to me very carefully," Admiral Harrison said, her voice becoming dangerously quiet. "Lieutenant General David Washington is one of the most decorated officers in the United States Army. He currently serves as Deputy Director of Operations at the Pentagon and reports directly to me. If you do not release him immediately, you will be dealing with federal authorities within the hour." Blake's confidence wavered for the first time. The woman on the phone didn't sound like someone playing a role. She sounded like someone who was used to having her orders followed without question. "Ma'am, with all due respect, how do I know you're really who you say you are?" Blake asked, though his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "Officer Stevens, in exactly 3 minutes, your dispatch is going to receive a call from the Pentagon duty officer, requesting confirmation of General Washington's status and location. In 5 minutes, you'll receive a call from your chief of police. In 10 minutes, if General Washington is not free to go, you'll receive a call from federal agents. Do I make myself clear?" Blake handed the phone back to David with shaking hands. Tony had been listening to the one-sided conversation with growing alarm, and he could see the blood draining from his partner's face. "Sir?" David said into the phone. "Thank you. I'll call you back once this is resolved." "David, are you sure you're not injured?" Admiral Harrison asked. "Do you need medical attention?" "No, sir, I'm fine. Just frustrated." "Understandably so. I'll be expecting your call within the hour. And David, document everything. Every name, every badge number, every word that was said. This kind of treatment of military personnel is unacceptable." "Yes, sir. I'll call you back soon." David ended the call and handed the phone back to Blake, who stood frozen in place, staring at the device as if it might explode. Tony was already walking back to his patrol car, presumably to check with dispatch. "Officer Stevens," David said quietly, "I'd like you to remove these handcuffs now." Blake's radio crackled to life before he could respond. "All units, this is dispatch with a priority message. We have a request from the Pentagon duty officer for immediate confirmation of the status and welfare of Lieutenant General David Washington, currently at the location of Unit 7. Unit 7, please respond immediately." Blake's hand shook as he reached for his radio. "Unit 7 to dispatch. Unit 7, confirm the status of Lieutenant General Washington." Blake looked at David, then at the crowd that had grown larger, and was now definitely recording everything with their phones. "Dispatch, the individual in question is. He's in custody pending verification of identity. Unit 7, you are ordered to release General Washington immediately and ensure his welfare. Chief Peterson is en route to your location. ED 5 minutes. Tony jogged back from his patrol car, his face pale. "Blake, we need to uncuff him right now. I just got 3 calls in 2 minutes. Pentagon, State Police, and the Chief's office." Blake fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked David's handcuffs. "I was just doing my job," he said, though the words sounded hollow even to him. David rubbed his wrists where the metal had left red marks, but his voice remained calm. "Officer Stevens, I understand you were concerned about verifying my identity, but the way you went about it was wrong." Before Blake could respond, another patrol car arrived with flashing lights, followed immediately by an unmarked sedan. Chief Peterson stepped out of the unmarked car, his face grim as he surveyed the scene. He was a 20-year veteran of law enforcement who had seen his share of problems, but this situation had the potential to destroy careers and land his department in federal court. "Stevens." "Rodriguez, step aside," Chief Peterson ordered. He approached David with obvious embarrassment. "General Washington, I'm Chief Peterson. I want to apologize on behalf of my department for this incident." David straightened to his full height, and for the first time since the stop began, Blake truly saw him as he was, not a criminal or a con man, but a career military officer who commanded respect through his bearing alone. "Chief Peterson," David replied with a slight nod. "I appreciate your apology. However, this incident raises serious concerns about your officer's training and judgment." The chief nodded grimly. "Sir, I assure you this will be investigated fully. Is there anything you need? Medical attention? An escort to your destination?" David looked around at the crowd, at the officers who had treated him like a criminal, at his scattered belongings that had been carelessly searched and tossed around. "I need my belongings returned to their proper order, and I need assurance that this won't happen to the next person who drives through your town." As if summoned by the mention of his belongings, another car arrived. This time it was a black SUV with government plates, and two men in suits stepped out. The cavalry had arrived, and Blake Stevens suddenly realized that his quiet afternoon traffic stop had just become the biggest mistake of his career. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people now, and David could see phones everywhere, recording every moment of what would undoubtedly become a viral video within hours. He thought about his mother, probably wondering why his visit had been so short. And he thought about Admiral Harrison, who was likely already drafting reports that would reach the highest levels of government. "Officer Stevens," David said, turning to face the man who had started this nightmare, "I hope you learned something from this experience." Blake couldn't meet his eyes. The confident, suspicious police officer from an hour ago had been replaced by someone who clearly understood that he had just made a career-ending mistake. The two federal agents approached the group with the purposeful stride of men accustomed to taking control of situations. The taller one, Agent Collins, flashed his credentials to Chief Peterson, while the shorter one, Agent Murphy, immediately walked over to David. "General Washington," Agent Murphy said with a respectful nod. "Agent Murphy, FBI, are you injured, sir?" "No injuries," David replied, though he was still rubbing his wrists where the handcuffs had been. "But I'd like to file a formal complaint about the conduct of these officers." Agent Collins had finished his brief conversation with Chief Peterson and now turned his attention to Blake and Tony, who stood off to the side looking like they wanted to disappear into the pavement. "Officers Stevens and Rodriguez, I need to speak with both of you separately about the events that occurred here today." Blake felt his stomach drop. FBI agents didn't show up for routine traffic stops, and he was beginning to understand just how badly he had miscalculated the situation. "Agent Collins, I was just doing my job. The guy had suspicious documents and his story didn't make sense. We'll discuss that in detail," Agent Collins replied curtly. "But first I need you both to understand something. Lieutenant General Washington is not just any military officer. He's currently involved in classified operations that affect national security. When you detained him and confiscated his materials, you potentially compromised ongoing military activities." Tony felt like he might be sick. His Marine background had taught him to respect the chain of command, and the realization that he'd been party to arresting a 3-star general was almost more than he could process. "Sir, we didn't know. His story just seemed so unlikely." "Unlikely?" Agent Murphy joined the conversation, having completed his initial assessment of David's condition. What exactly seemed unlikely about a military officer visiting his elderly mother? Blake tried to rally his remaining confidence. "Come on, you've got to admit it's suspicious. A general driving around by himself in a regular car, claiming to have classified documents? That's not normal." Agent Collins studied Blake with the kind of look that police officers usually reserved for suspects they were about to arrest. "Officer Stevens, let me explain something to you about military operations. High-ranking officers don't travel with fanfare for personal business. They don't drive government vehicles to visit family, and they frequently carry classified materials as part of their duties. What you thought was suspicious is actually completely normal for someone of General Washington's rank and responsibilities." Chief Peterson stepped forward, clearly trying to manage the growing disaster. "Agents, my officers, were responding to what they perceived as unusual circumstances. While their judgment may have been flawed, their intentions were to protect the community." "Chief Peterson," Agent Collins said, "with all due respect, your officer didn't just make a judgment error. He refused to verify General Washington's credentials through proper channels, ignored multiple opportunities to de-escalate the situation, and ultimately arrested a senior military official based on nothing more than his own biases. The word biases hung in the air like a challenge. Blake wanted to protest, to argue that race had nothing to do with his decision-making, but even as the thought formed, he couldn't entirely convince himself it was true. Would he have been as suspicious of a white man with the same story and credentials? David watched the exchange with a mixture of vindication and sadness. He'd been through variations of this scene before, though never quite as dramatically. The moment when authority figures realized they'd made a terrible mistake was always the same, a combination of defensive justification and dawning horror at the consequences. Agent Murphy's phone buzzed, and he stepped aside to take the call. When he returned, his expression was even more serious. That was the Pentagon. General Washington was supposed to be in a classified briefing an hour ago. His absence triggered security protocols because they assumed something had happened to him. Blake felt the last of his confidence crumble. Not only had he arrested a general, but he'd potentially disrupted national security operations. The small-town police officer who'd started the afternoon feeling like he was protecting his community now realized he might have caused an international incident. Furthermore, Agent Murphy continued, the documents in General Washington's vehicle that Officer Stevens found so suspicious, they're related to ongoing military operations in 3 different theaters. By detaining him and searching those materials, you may have compromised active missions. Tony looked like he wanted to crawl into a hole and disappear. His military experience made him acutely aware of how serious it was to interfere with classified operations. Agent Murphy, we didn't look at the actual contents of the documents. Officer Stevens just saw that they were marked classified and became suspicious. And instead of following proper procedures for handling potentially classified materials, he decided to conduct his own investigation. Agent Collins replied, did either of you receive training on how to handle situations involving military personnel or classified documents? Both officers shook their heads. Blake was beginning to realize that his department's training had some serious gaps that had just cost him everything. Chief Peterson's radio crackled with another urgent message. Chief, we've got the mayor on line 1, the county commissioner on line 2, and someone from the governor's office holding on line 3. They all want to know what the hell is going on out there. The chief closed his eyes for a moment, clearly calculating the political fallout from the incident. Tell them I'll call them back in 10 minutes, he said into his radio, then turned back to the federal agents. Agents, what can we do to resolve this situation? Agent Collins looked at David, who had remained quietly observant throughout the exchange. That's really up to General Washington. This is his complaint to file or not file. All eyes turned to David, who took his time before responding. The crowd of onlookers had grown even larger, and he could see local news vans arriving at the perimeter of the scene. Social media had undoubtedly already picked up the story, and by evening it would be national news. I want to understand something first, David said, looking directly at Blake. Officer Stevens, when you first approached my vehicle, what exactly made you suspicious? Blake shifted uncomfortably under the general's steady gaze. You had out-of-state plates and you looked... you seemed... I seemed what, Officer Stevens? The question hung in the air, and everyone present understood the implication. Blake felt trapped between honesty and self-preservation, knowing that whatever he said next would likely be recorded. Judge Patricia Williams from the county courthouse had been invited to speak about the legal implications of the incident. She stood and addressed the room. I want everyone to understand the serious legal consequences of what happened. Violating someone's civil rights under color of law is a federal crime with serious penalties, but more than that, it undermines public trust in law enforcement. From the back of the room, Blake Stevens' wife Michelle stood up, her voice shaking with emotion. My husband made a terrible mistake, and our family is paying the price. But he's not a racist. He was trying to do his job. The room fell silent. David hadn't expected Blake's family to attend the meeting, and he could see the pain in the woman's face. Her husband's career was over, their financial security destroyed, and their reputation in the community ruined. Mrs. Stevens, David said gently, I don't believe your husband is inherently racist, but I do believe he made decisions based on unconscious biases that led to a serious violation of my rights. The goal of these meetings isn't to destroy people. It's to prevent these situations from happening again. Michelle Stevens sat back down, wiping tears from her eyes. David made a mental note to speak with her privately after the meeting. Dr. James Mitchell, a psychology professor from the nearby university, had been helping develop the bias training curriculum. General Washington is right that most officers aren't consciously racist. But research shows that we all have unconscious biases that affect our decision-making. The key is recognizing these biases and developing systems to counteract them. The discussion continued for another hour, covering everything from community policing strategies to the importance of diverse hiring in law enforcement. David was impressed by the level of engagement and the genuine desire for improvement he saw in many of the attendees. As the meeting concluded, people began filing out, but many lingered to continue conversations in smaller groups. David noticed officers talking with community members, veterans sharing experiences with police personnel, and civil rights advocates working with local leaders on implementation strategies. Michelle Stevens approached David as he was packing up his materials. "General Washington, could I speak with you privately?" They found a quiet corner of the auditorium, away from the crowds. Michelle looked exhausted, her face drawn with stress and worry. "I don't know what to say," she began. "Blake destroyed our lives in one afternoon. But I keep thinking about you sitting in that police car, and I can't imagine how that felt." David studied her face, seeing genuine remorse alongside her pain. "Mrs. Stevens, I've been thinking about your family too. This situation has no winners. Is there any way my husband could make amends? Could he help with your training programs or speak to other officers about what not to do?" David considered the request carefully. Blake Stevens had become a pariah in law enforcement circles, his name synonymous with racial profiling and poor judgment. But there might be value in having him share his experience as a cautionary tale. "Mrs. Stevens, I'm willing to consider that possibility if your husband is genuinely committed to change and education, but it would have to be done carefully, with proper oversight, and only if it serves the larger goal of preventing similar incidents." Hope flickered in Michelle's eyes for the first time in weeks. "He is committed, General Washington. This whole experience has changed him. He knows he was wrong and he wants to do something positive with it." Over the following months, David's work in Millbrook became a model for police community relations nationwide. The training protocols he developed with Captain Chen were adopted by dozens of departments across the country. The community meetings evolved into a permanent citizens oversight committee that provided ongoing input on police policies and procedures. Blake Stevens eventually did join the education effort, speaking at police academies about the consequences of unconscious bias and the importance of following proper procedures. His presentations were powerful, precisely because they came from someone who had experienced the full consequences of getting it wrong. Tony Rodriguez completed his retraining and returned to duty as a different kind of officer. His military experience, combined with the lessons learned from the incident, made him an advocate for proper procedures and community engagement within his department. 6 months after the incident, David received a letter from a young police officer in Ohio who had attended one of his training sessions. The officer wrote about a situation where he'd encountered a veteran with PTSD who was acting strangely in public. Instead of immediately assuming criminal behavior, the officer had taken time to talk with the man, learned about his military service, and connected him with veteran services. The letter credited David's training with helping him see the situation differently. The ripple effects continued to spread. Military bases began offering cultural competency training to local law enforcement agencies. Police departments started building relationships with veteran organizations. Community groups across the country organized their own dialogue sessions about bias and justice. David never forgot the humiliation of that afternoon in Millbrook, the feeling of handcuffs on his wrists or the dismissal of his military service. But he also never forgot the opportunity it created to make meaningful change. His mother had been right about one thing. He had given enough to his country through his military service. Now he was giving something different but equally valuable through his work on civil rights and community relations. The small town of Millbrook, once known for little more than its quiet streets and friendly residents, became a symbol of how communities can confront their problems honestly and work together toward solutions. It wasn't perfect and the work was ongoing, but it was proof that even the most difficult situations can become catalysts for positive change. And Lieutenant General David Washington, who had started that day simply wanting to visit his mother and drive home quietly, had found himself at the center of a movement that would outlast his military career and define his legacy in ways he never could have imagined, and replayed countless times. "You seem like you didn't belong here," Blake finally said, the words sounding weak even to his own ears. "I didn't belong in the town where my mother has lived for 30 years?" David asked quietly. "I didn't belong on the streets where I played as a child when I visited my grandmother." Agent Murphy stepped forward. "General, we need to discuss next steps. Are you prepared to file formal complaints against these officers?" David looked around at the scene. The federal agents, the embarrassed police chief, the two officers who looked like they wanted to disappear, and the crowd of citizens recording everything on their phones. He thought about his mother, who had raised him to believe in justice and fairness, and about the uniform he wore, which represented values of honor and service to all Americans. "Agent Murphy," David said finally, "I want to understand the full scope of what happened here before I decide on formal action. But I can tell you this. Something needs to change. Not just with these individual officers, but with the system that allowed this to happen." Blake's phone started ringing, and he glanced at it to see his wife's number. Word was already spreading through the small town, and he realized that by evening everyone would know about his spectacular mistake. His career was over, his reputation destroyed, and possibly his family's future as well. Tony stood in silence, processing the magnitude of what had occurred. He'd joined the police force to serve his community, drawing on his military experience to protect and help people. Now he'd been party to arresting the kind of officer he'd once served under, and the irony was almost too much to bear. Chief Peterson's radio crackled again with another urgent message, this time from the county sheriff's office, asking if federal assistance was needed. The chief realized that what had started as a simple traffic stop had escalated into a multi-agency incident with federal implications. Agent Collins pulled out his phone and began making calls, coordinating with various agencies about the incident. David could hear fragments of conversations about official reports, congressional briefings, and media management. The machinery of government was slowly grinding into action, and Blake Stevens was about to become the center of a storm that would reach the highest levels of federal authority. "General Washington," Agent Murphy said, "we should probably get you to a secure location where you can contact your chain of command and brief them on what happened." David nodded, but first he walked over to his sedan and began collecting his scattered belongings. The documents that Blake had carelessly rifled through contained information about military operations that affected thousands of American service members around the world. The casual way they'd been handled and dismissed made David's anger flare again. As he organized his papers, David could hear Blake trying to explain himself to Agent Collins, his voice growing more desperate as he realized the magnitude of his error. The confident, suspicious police officer from 2 hours ago had been replaced by someone who clearly understood that his world was about to change forever. The sun was beginning to set over Millbrook, casting long shadows across the street where David's quiet family visit had turned into a federal incident. As he closed his trunk and prepared to follow the federal agents to continue dealing with the aftermath, David thought about the phone call he'd need to make to his mother explaining why his visit had been cut short and why she might be seeing her son on the evening news. The small town that had seemed so peaceful that morning was about to become the center of a national conversation about racial profiling, police training, and the treatment of military personnel. And Blake Stevens, who had started his shift thinking he was just doing his job, was about to discover that some mistakes can't be undone. 3 weeks later, Lieutenant General David Washington sat in a conference room at the Pentagon, reviewing the final report on what the media had dubbed the Millbrook incident. The story had indeed gone viral within hours, generating millions of views and sparking nationwide discussions about racial profiling, police training, and civil rights. His phone had been ringing constantly with interview requests, speaking engagements, and calls from politicians wanting to be associated with his story. The immediate consequences for Officer Blake Stevens had been swift and severe. He'd been suspended without pay pending a full investigation, and federal charges had been filed for violating David's civil rights under color of law. His police career was over, his pension lost, and his family was facing financial ruin. The man who'd thought he was protecting his community had instead brought national shame upon it. Officer Tony Rodriguez had received a lesser punishment, a 6-month suspension and mandatory retraining. His military background had earned him some consideration, but he still faced disciplinary action for failing to intervene when the situation escalated beyond reasonable bounds. He'd publicly apologized and had been cooperating fully with all investigations. Chief Peterson had announced his retirement, effective immediately. The political pressure from the mayor, county commissioners, and governor's office had made his position untenable. The Millbrook Police Department was now under federal oversight, with new training requirements and supervision protocols that would remain in place for at least 5 years. But for David, the most important changes were happening at ground level. He'd spent the past 3 weeks traveling to Millbrook repeatedly, not for legal proceedings or media interviews, but for community meetings. The federal charges and administrative punishments were one thing. Real change required something deeper. On this particular Thursday evening, David stood before a packed auditorium at Millbrook Community Center. The audience was a mixture of local residents, police officers from surrounding departments, civil rights activists, and military veterans. The conversations hadn't always been comfortable, but they'd been necessary. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," David began, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "This is our 4th community meeting, and I can see we're making progress." In the front row sat Mrs. Eleanor Washington, David's 78-year-old mother, wearing her best church dress and beaming with pride at her son. Next to her sat Mrs. Patterson, her next-door neighbor for 20 years, who'd told the local newspaper that she'd always known Eleanor's son was someone special, even before she knew exactly what he did for a living. "When I was first detained 3 weeks ago," David continued, "I was angry, I was frustrated, I was hurt. But as I've reflected on that experience, I've realized that anger alone doesn't solve problems. It takes understanding, education, and a commitment to change." In the middle section of the auditorium, several police officers sat together, including some from departments in neighboring towns. They'd initially attended these meetings reluctantly, but David's approach had surprised them. Instead of attacks or blame, he'd focused on education and bridge building. Captain Lisa Chen from the State Police Training Academy raised her hand. "General Washington, can you talk about the new training protocols you've been helping us develop?" David nodded. "Captain Chen and I have been working on a comprehensive program that addresses several key areas. First, proper procedures for verifying military credentials and handling classified materials. Second, de-escalation techniques for encounters with citizens who may seem unfamiliar or out of place. And third, understanding unconscious bias and how it affects decision-making." A young police officer near the back raised his hand nervously. "Sir, how do we know when someone's credentials are real? I mean, Officer Stevens thought he was being careful." "That's an excellent question, officer." David paused, waiting for the man to identify himself. "Officer Johnson, sir. I've been on the force for 2 years." "Officer Johnson, the key is following established protocols instead of making assumptions. Every military branch has verification procedures. Every government agency has duty officers who can confirm identity. The problem wasn't that Officer Stevens was being cautious. It was that he refused to use the proper channels when I offered them." David clicked to the next slide in his presentation, which showed a flowchart of proper verification procedures. "If someone claims to be military personnel, you can contact the base duty officer, the Pentagon duty desk, or military police. These calls take 5 minutes and provide definitive answers. There's no guesswork involved." Maria Rodriguez, a local teacher and Tony Rodriguez's sister, stood up. "General Washington, my brother made a mistake and he knows it. But he's a good man who served his country. What can officers do to make sure they don't end up in situations like this?" David's expression softened. "Your brother has been very cooperative with the investigation, and I appreciate his service record. The answer to your question is training, oversight, and most importantly, the courage to speak up when a situation isn't going right." He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. Officer Rodriguez had multiple opportunities to suggest proper verification procedures. He had moments when he could have de-escalated the situation. Good officers need to be willing to redirect their partners when they see things going wrong.